Meet musical trailblazer, Dr. Clarence E. Knight, Jr., with a career as a musician in musical theater, music education, administration, and community service that spans 6 decades. While attending Howard University, Clarence was the lead saxophonist at the famed Howard Theater, where the orchestra backed up legendary performers like Lou Rawls, Sonny Till and the Orioles, Moms Mabley, Red Fox, and many more. In 1971, some of his most significant work began with Clarence E. Knight Productions, working as a musical contractor, providing services and musicians for the who's who of the entertainment world. He established the Clarence Knight Orchestra, performing at some of the most significant and highly visible events, including the Congressional Black Caucus dinners, at 5 presidential balls, and becoming the first African-American musical director for the National Football League's Washington Redskins Jazz Band. Now, sit back, relax, and hear this amazing story about legendary musical trailblazer Dr. Clarence E. Knight, Jr.
Clarence E. Knight, Jr., December 23rd, 1936.
Okay, and where were you born?
Norfolk, Virginia.
Okay. And tell us a little bit about growing up in Norfolk.
Well, actually, I didn't grow up in Norfolk. My mother and father were teachers here in North Carolina, and we moved to Farmville when I was about 6, 7 months old.
So your earliest recollection then is in living in North Carolina.
That's true, in Farmville, yes.
And your mother and father both were teachers.
Both were teachers.
And what school did they teach at there? Do you remember?
Well, my father started in Ayden, North Carolina, and my mother, she taught out at a little place in the country called Belle Arthur, I think it was.
And tell us your parents' names.
My mother's name was Mary Knight, and my father's name was Clarence Knight, because I'm Clarence Jr.
So do you have any brothers or sisters?
No, I'm an only child.
Only child. Well, that's kind of unusual for back then. Well, that's good. And your father also had a period of time there where he was a principal of a school.
Yeah, that was at H.B. Sugg, which was in Farmville.
In Farmville, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So that's terrific. When did you first get interested in music?
Well, it was kind of strange because the first house we lived in didn't have a piano. The second one that we moved into had an old piano that, of course, hadn't been tuned or anything. It was kind of funny. And I was very young, about 3, maybe 4 years old, and I went into that room and just started playing the piano without any training whatsoever. And during that time, I don't know if you remember the Sears and Roebuck catalogs and so forth.
Yes.
I had to sit up on those catalogs in order to reach the keyboard. And so that's when I really started playing. And I sat down and started playing things like the boogie woogie and stuff and had never been trained.
My gosh. So your parents also played?
No, unfortunately, my father was not a trained musician, and my mother, she only got involved in music at a later time in her life when she started taking piano lessons.
So you led the charge.
Yes, but fortunately, in my family though, there are some people in my family who were very talented. They were not professional musicians, but they all could perform like singing and doing things in the church and so forth. But they didn't live in Farmville. They lived in other places in North Carolina.
So you had a piano in your home and you liked that and didn't have any formal training, but you were interested in music. What was your first instrument outside of playing the piano?
The soprano saxophone.
Okay.
My father went over to Kinston and bought me a little soprano, the small one. It was curved just like a regular alto, but it was a soprano.
And that was the right size for a kid 7 or 8 or 9 years old, I guess.
Well, actually, he bought it when I was 5.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, I was 5.
And did you take lessons at that point?
Well, I actually started taking piano lessons when they discovered that I was sort of talented in piano. They actually hired a piano teacher to come in to give me lessons. I didn't particularly like the lessons that I was getting, mainly because she used to crack my knuckles
Oh, ouch.
to make me keep my fingers curved, because I always played with my fingers stretched out, and so what she did was she would crack my knuckles, and I sort of didn't like that. So
Tried to get you to bend them.
yeah, tried to get me to play the right way, I guess.
Wow.
So, but I continued to take piano for a while, and then when I got the saxophone, that's when I started taking those lessons.
So you're playing saxophone. Did you play in the school bands? Was that?
Yes, I started off in the elementary band because the beauty about that school that I was at HB Sugg, they had three levels of bands there. They had the little elementary band, they had the intermediate band, and then they had the high school band. So I was able to start off in the elementary band first.
So in those days at HB Sugg, was it divided into elementary, junior high, and high school, or were all of the grades in the same building?
All the grades were in the same building.
Okay.
And it
So
wasn't a junior high school.
not at all.
The organization was like 1 through 8 and 9 through 12.
So that worked out. So you knew you were going to the next band, but you were still in the same school. So that really provided some comfort.
Well, not only that, the thing that was kind of interesting, because I was, and I'm using this in my own vernacular, as talented as I was, I also got a chance to interact with the upper level bands, even though I was playing in the elementary band, because I progressed real quickly on the saxophone.
So playing the saxophone, when did you first get interested in any kind of writing or writing a song?
That started real early, because I used to listen to a lot of music. I listened to records all the time. Some of those people that I liked during that time when I was young was people like Earl Bostic and some other names that were out there playing. And I used to listen to them a lot on the radio, and I had a good ear. So like, what I would do is write down some of the solos and melodies they were playing, and then I would duplicate them myself on my saxophone.
You know, I find it interesting. I'm not sure what age it was, but you decided you'd put a hand at trying to compose a school song.
Yes, I did that.
Tell us about that.
That was kind of interesting because we, as I say, you have to remember, and we were a very close community, and all of the people in the band were like brothers and sisters. And so when we were talking about the school song, it was sort of a collective thing between me and about 3 or 4 other people. And I wrote the music, and some of the other people began to pick out the lyrics and so forth for it. So we finished that product, I guess, it took us about a year to complete it, to get it where the school actually bought into it.
So it's the HB Sugg school song?
Yes.
And do they still use it? Did they continue?
I understand they do, from what I hear.
Well, that's quite an honor.
Yeah.
So you did well in school and you progressed in your skills as a musician, and you entered Howard University at a fairly early age.
Yeah, I was 16.
So at 16, a big change. Farmville, North Carolina to the Washington, D.C. area and Howard University.
Yeah, quite a change.
How did you manage that?
Well, initially, let me give you a historic perspective. You know, back in those days, your parents didn't really, well, I say this, my parents didn't really think that music was the proper way to go as a career. So in most cases, they thought that the career path should be either teaching or in medicine or something like that. So the reason I went to Howard really wasn't to go into music. It was to go into pre-med. But once I got there, I said, no, this is not for me. I'm not going to be a doctor. In fact, I told somebody one time, if you come into my office as a doctor and you're bleeding, you're going to die. So I figured right away that that wasn't for me. So what I spent a lot of time doing when I went to D.C. was going to the clubs and all that kind of stuff, listening to all these musicians. And so I said, this is what I need to be doing. So I actually changed my major the second semester that I was there.
And DC then and now has a great music scene.
Oh, yeah.
It was the who's who of artists performing at the time.
Well, you know, they called it Little Harlem. I think that's the term that they used during that time, that it was Little Harlem.
And there's another very famous venue there, and you had the privilege of working there, the Howard Theater.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about the Howard Theater.
Well, the Howard Theater was, as you know, they call it the Chitlin Circuit. It included the Howard Theater in D.C., of course, the Apollo in New York, the Royal Theater in Baltimore. There was a theater in Philadelphia at that time, one in Norfolk, Virginia, and the one in Chicago. So what would happen is that these acts that were out there during that time, there was a lot of groups and singers and what have you, and you know, the Jackie Wilson time, all those people, Al Hibbler and so forth. Anyway, to make a long story short, those groups would perform on the Chitlin Circuit, which included the Howard Theater. So what we would do is that when they came to Howard, we would back them up.
So you were in the house band. So I thought that's interesting. We talked a little bit about that earlier before we started recording, that artists would travel and work with bands that were in theaters because of the quality of what you offered.
That's true. Most of the time, the only thing they brought with them was maybe one or two of their rhythm players, but for the most part, all of the horn players were the ones that were in the house band.
So from 1954 to 58, I believe,
Yes.
you were in the house band at the Howard Theater.
That's true.
And Howard Theater is one of the most historic and famous theaters in the United States, opened in 1910 and was known as Theater of the People.
That's true.
What a great place, and what a wonderful opportunity for you. Who were some of the people you backed up at the Howard Theater when you were in the house band?
Well, let me see if I can remember. We backed up Pearl Bailey. We backed up Lena Horne. We backed up Big Maybelle. We backed up Al Hibbler. And just so many groups like the Sonny Teal and the Orioles.
And it was a place where bands made their name.
Oh,
I know
yeah.
there's a story about the International Sweethearts of Rhythm, which was an all-female orchestra that played at the Howard Theater, and the halftime show was Billie Holiday.
That's
so
true.
you had
That's true.
some pretty great performers.
Yeah.
It was kind of the who's who, and from Duke to Miles to Bird, everybody played at the Howard. Count Basie.
Yeah.
It was the who's who, and you had a very wonderful start to be able to go to Howard University, wonderful music department, and while you were there, be the lead alto saxophonist.
Yeah.
Wow.
I played lead in that band the whole time I was there.
You also played at some of the other very famous theaters. You played at the Apollo Theater in New York City, the Royal Theater in Baltimore. We talked about that being on the Chitlin Circuit. Again, the Regal Theater in Chicago, another one.
Yeah.
But a lot of stars. There's video of you playing with Lou Rawls that I have seen, Jackie Wilson, Moms Mabley, Red Fox, Billy Eckstein. Almost the who's who of who plays out there, the great bands. But all of that kind of had to take a pause because you went into the military.
Yeah, I was in ROTC at Howard, and I received my commission when I graduated. I was a second lieutenant. So the obligation that you have is a 2-year in-service obligation that you have when you graduate. So what I did, I came back here to North Carolina and taught out here at Bruce Falkland Elementary School for 2 years, and then I went on active duty. And after that time, I went to flight school and became a pilot, fixed wing at first, and then went to helicopter transition school, and I served in Vietnam for 13 months and so forth. When I came back to the country, I went to the helicopter training organization where I was actually an instructor pilot. And then in 1968, I retired from the military and came back to D.C.
So one other thing I want you to tell us about. Right after you graduated from Howard, and you went to taught at Falkland, North Carolina for a couple of years, you also engaged another person that you knew at that time to come to Falkland and to teach, I believe, vocal music. Who was that?
That was Roberta Flack.
Roberta
In fact,
Flack.
Roberta was my classmate at Howard. So what happened was they needed a choir director, and so they called me and asked me if I had a friend, in my class that would be interested in having a job, and I recommended Roberta. And she actually came and taught in Farmville at HB Sugg. I was the one that was in Bruce Falkland. She was in Farmville.
Wow.
So I brought her back to Farmville.
My gosh! Well, that's wonderful. And a helicopter pilot. You don't think of musicians being helicopter pilots, but you served tour Vietnam and received a number of commendations and served your country well. But to me, a big story begins after your discharge, and you come back to the Washington, D.C. area, 1967, 1968. Not only working as a professional musician, but as a music contractor. Tell us about that.
That was very interesting. What I need to let you know is how I decided to become a contractor. When I came back to D.C., the situation there was sort of volatile, really, in that a lot of the nice jobs that they had in Washington were not being offered to a lot of the black musicians. So I took it upon myself to say, well, wait a minute, if these groups are coming to D.C., and especially the ones coming in from Motown, we should have better representation. And there's a lot of good musicians in this town that are quite capable to play these shows. So I actually had my first experience of playing at a club in Washington called the Cellar Door. And the group that I played behind was Martha and the Vandellas. So the guys who owned the Cellar Door, for some reason, they took a liking to me. And they decided that they were going to set up this large company called Cellar Door Productions. Right away, they called me to be their contractor. So they were promoting all of these shows around the country and a lot in the Washington DMV area. And all the shows that they promoted, I was a contractor. So I provided the musicians behind all these acts. Then on the scene came a black-owned organization called Dimensions Entertainment. Cellar Door really was the first organization that sort of supported Dimensions. And so right away, the gentleman's name was Bill Washington. I met him and we talked and I became his contractor. So I had the contract for backing up musicians for these shows with both of those organizations, Cellar Door Production and Dimensions Entertainment. So that's pretty much how it started. And just about every show that was in this area, I was the person that backed them up.
So let's put some names and faces so people understand exactly how that would work. So the Cellar Door would book, let's give an example of someone that you would provide a group for.
Like Smokey Robinson.
Okay, Smokey Robinson was coming in. Smokey Robinson and the Miracles to play.
Right,
he needed a band.
So I would provide the band for him.
You provided the band.
Right.
But the problem was Washington, D.C. area had lots of not just good black musicians, wonderfully trained and skilled black musicians.
Right.
And they weren't getting work until as much until you started Clarence Knight Productions, and
That's
you
true.
put the bands together that employed these good musicians backing up these national acts.
That's true. That's the way it worked.
That's exactly how it worked. And if it hadn't been for you, a lot of those musicians that deserved those jobs would have never gotten them.
That's true.
Just plain and simple.
They were not being called.
And besides the two groups that we mentioned, the Cellar Door organization and the other one, you expanded. It got bigger.
Yeah, I started working for a lot of people. The word got around, I guess, that if you go into Washington, then the person you need to call was Clarence.
That's exactly right. That's
Right.
the only name they needed.
Right.
So if Ella Fitzgerald came to town, did they call Clarence Knight?
That's right. Regardless of who came to town, they would call me.
So any of the big names, you're the guy that put the bands together. Sometimes you played in the band, sometimes you were playing somewhere else, and you put other musicians together, and it was top-notch performances.
Right. Yeah. In fact, a number of times I would have 3 or 4 shows in different locations, so I could only be in one place at a time. But I had a person that worked with me who would make sure that he would be at one of the other locations to take care of the business end.
You know, to people watching you, they'd think, well, he stayed busy just, putting these bands together and playing a few gigs, but that's not necessarily what happened. You
No.
continued as an educator and continue in educating today, mentoring, teaching lessons. You also had a job doing some other things during that time.
Yeah, I did a lot of things. I've taught at all the levels. I mean, I've taught elementary, junior, and senior high, and my last profession was at Bowie State University, where I spent 30 years at the college level. So on that side of the coin, I've done an awful lot of work and made I think a major contribution in as an educational professor. And I'm very proud to say that I'm emeritus also. I got my doctoral degree from George Washington University and Bowie State University. When I retired from there, gave me the emeritus status.
You are Dr. Clarence Knight, and I want to talk a little bit about something that I find very interesting, and that is professional football. You know, what would professional football have to do with Dr. Clarence Knight? And, well, let's tell that story. You were the first African-American musical director for the national football team Jazz Ensemble. Now, that's a lot to say, but help us to understand that a little bit.
Well, and to give you a little history on what happened, when I was at Howard, the Washington Redskins used to play at the stadium called Griffith Stadium. They had a little teepee on top of the stadium where they had a jazz band. And so that sort of moved to the new stadium, which was RFK. And so they continued to have a jazz band for a long time. But the thing that I think that most people recognize about bands and the National Football League is that there's only 2 teams that I know of that had marching bands. And that was the Ravens, Baltimore, and the Washington Redskins. Well, the jazz band continued to be there for all these years. So in 1985, I got a call for an interview to become the band director for the jazz band for the Washington Redskins. So I held that position for 15 years, from 1985 to 2000. And that's true. I was the first African-American band director for a jazz band in the National Football League.
And at the same time, you're performing on the weekends, backing up the biggest names from Motown as well as others. And you're a tenured professor at Bowie State University, teaching students.
Yes.
Not only with the instruments that you play, but you secured funding for an electronic music program there. Tell us about that.
Well, actually what happened, when I went to Bowie, I was totally dismayed with the facilities that they had for the fine and performing arts. it was just not adequate. So, of course, being as aggressive as I am, I opened my mouth, and the president said to me, "Okay, if you don't like what you see, then here, you got the project, go for it." So I started working on it. I did a proposal. I started to meet people in the political people that you have to talk to try to get funding. And of course, the initial funding had to be the funding to do the study. And so we got that approved. And over a period of about 10, 12 years of doing all of the things that you have to do with the political people, in the state and so forth, because it's a state-run organization, we finally got the funding approved to build a new fine and performing arts center. And in that center, we have all state-of-the-art facilities. And as you were saying about the studio, we have an excellent music studio in there, for a recording studio in that building. And I like to fast forward to something that just happened recently. I also helped to get our theater renamed. That theater has now been renamed as the Dionne Warwick Theater at Bowie State University.
Wow.
I'm very proud of that.
A friend of yours.
Yes.
Absolutely. So, what people need to realize, it truly was a fine arts, performing arts center. Yeah. Art, music, dance, theater, computer graphics art.
That's true.
What an asset to any college or university.
Yeah.
I bet Howard wished you were back over there.
I don't know. I think that really Bowie needed, and I'm saying this in a way that I feel inside of me. I think Bowie needed me worse than Howard did. If you understand what I'm saying.
Well, with those kinds of results, I think that they would have been thrilled to have Dr. Clarence Knight working the kinds of things that you did. But certainly Bowie State was such a wonderful recipient, and what a wonderful renaming that you've done. Let's talk about some of the groups you played with. I think that's very interesting. I've seen, I think I mentioned videos of you with Lou Rawls, Smokey Robinson. We mentioned Tina Turner, Tom Jones, Gladys Knight and the Pips. You're pretty close with Gladys.
Yes.
Tell us a Gladys Knight story.
That story goes a long way back. Actually, Gladys and I are like distant cousins, and I'm saying it that way because my son did the research on all of our family history, and so when I say distant, it's like far away, but yet close enough. But I started working with Gladys back in the '60s, like you say, when it was the Pips, And of course, that has evolved now where a couple of the Pips are gone. Her brother is still living, Bubba's still living. But she now performs pretty much by herself. But I provided all kinds of support for Gladys over the years. And I've worked with her all over the country, traveling with her with a big band. We've had a big band behind her for years. And that sort of, depended on the contractual kind of arrangements that she had. Sometimes when she would travel, she wouldn't use the band. And I guess that had to do with her agents and so forth in terms of who she took. But I've had a long, long relationship with Gladys Knight. And as I say, with the organization for a long time.
Let's talk about someone else that you are close to and have an organization, the lady that you just got the theater renamed after.
Yeah, that's a long relationship too. I've provided strings behind her a number of times over the country. I mean, one of the times that was kind of interesting was the Hampton Jazz Festival, what they used to have every year, where I provided mostly only strings, because she didn't use horns too much behind her. It was mostly string ensembles. But yeah, I've done that for Dion for a number of years.
So Dionne Warwick is who we're talking about and who the theater is named after. And you've been very close with her. There are some other names that I think people are readily familiar with that you provided the bands for and are close to. Patti LaBelle.
Patti LaBelle, a number of times. And we've also done Broadway shows with her. Patti did Your Arms Too Short, The Box with God, I think that's the name of it. And but that was a theater performance, not a concert. But I've done concerts with her, and I've also done theater performance with Patti.
Well, and you've done a lot of theaters, and that segues into, so it's not just concerts. While you're teaching at Bowie State University, you're putting bands together for the top Motown acts that tour not only in the Washington, D.C. area, but around the country. You are involved in your own performing, touring with different people like Roberta Flack and not Roberta Flack, but different artists. Mm-hmm. And besides that, you are in music for theater productions. How did you do so many things at once?
That's a question I can't answer. It's a very difficult question, you know. I tell you, I'm a strong believer that God put us here for a reason. And I think that a lot of these things happen because I was in the right place at the right time. And that it's no other way to look at it, because you're right. I was doing a lot of things at one time. My musical theater experiences, for an example, started in New York, where I did The Wiz and so forth.
Well, let's talk about some of those. The Wiz, the Tap Dance Kid, The King and I, Ain't Misbehavin'. That's, gosh, such great music.
Camelot.
Chicago, great music. The Color Purple, Fiddler on the Roof. The list goes on and on and on.
That's right. And see, another of my contracting experiences, too, was the Warner Theater in Washington, D.C. I had that position for a little over 15 years, where I provided music for all of the Broadway shows that came into the Warner. So, and we did them just about every week. We'd have a show, and some of them ran 2 weeks. I mean, people like Maurice Hines, who was doing shows, and all of those shows I contracted. All of them.
And besides the live performances, your recording credits are quite extensive also.
Yes, I've done a lot of recordings. I guess I'm sort of under this, how do you say it? Sort of behind the scenes in a lot of things where I'm not up front. So in fact, I'm writing a book now, and it's going to be entitled Under the Radar, because a lot of the things that I've done, nobody, except the people that I did it with, really knew who I was, because I'm behind the scenes, you know, providing all these services. But the public really didn't know. I mean, they have no way of knowing, you know, that I'm doing this. But yeah, on the Broadway side, when I say Broadway, I'm talking about in terms of those type of shows. My biggest stint was done at the Warner Theater, because I was there for a little over 15 years also.
Wow. Wow. You've cut back a little bit, but you're still pretty active.
Yes, I don't do as much work. I think now, when people call me to do shows, for an example, I actually refer some of my people that I've trained. When I say trained, a lot of the people who have worked with me, I sort of turn those things over to them and let them do it. I still assist them in terms of, you know, recommending the musicians that should fill these positions, because since I've had all this experience with the musicians, I know who they are and what they're capable of doing. And then a lot of the single things I turn over to my students, because I have a lot of very capable students out there who are playing quite well. So if people call me to do it, I just recommend my students to do it and let them do it.
And I think, you know, what we talked about earlier, I think is really key, is that there's an awful lot of talented musicians, awful lot of talented African-American musicians, but they weren't necessarily getting the work opportunities that they deserved based on their talent. And you were a game changer in the fact that for the who's who of Motown and many other genres, they would call you, you would put the bands together, and it was some of the top players available anywhere in the country.
That's true. And let me add to you something else to you that you need to know. It wasn't just the musicians in Washington, D.C. or the DMV area that I was hiring. I also knew a lot of musicians in New York, Philadelphia, and other places around close that I could use if the musicians in D.C. were not available. And having said that, I'll give you an example. We did Aretha Franklin at Coney Island about 3 or 4 years ago. And I already had most of my DMV people working at another show, so they couldn't do Aretha. So I hired most of the musicians that did Aretha out of Philadelphia because I had used, some of the guys from Philadelphia to play for me in that area when we were up there, like in Newark. And if I had to go to New York, I would hire some of my New York musicians that I knew. So I had musicians that I knew in different parts of the country that I would use based on where I was. I'll give you another example. I was a music contractor in the DMV, which is Washington, D.C., Baltimore area. But I had a contractor friend who lived in Chicago, and I had a very close contractor friend of mine who lived in L.A. So we sort of did a coordinating thing here. If I, for an example, had to go to Gladys to California, I would not take the Washington, D.C. musicians to California. I would call my buddy in L.A. and say, listen, we're booked in L.A. such and such a date. Can you provide the musicians for me? And so he would do it. His name was Ernie Fields. He would do it out there in L.A. I had a friend of mine named Bowie who lived in Chicago. So if I had something in the Chicago area, Indiana, places like that, I wouldn't travel with all these musicians from Washington. I would call Bowie and say, Bowie, Aretha Franklin is going to be in Chicago. I need for you to give me the musicians to back her up. So I sort of had a nice little situation going with friends of mine who were in other parts of the country who would also hire musicians to back up these groups when I was called to do the contracting. If I didn't want to travel or have my musicians from D.C. to travel, I would hire the local musicians in those areas.
And I think the thing that people need to understand is not only were you a contractor, you were a friend and a colleague of not only the musicians, but the stars that perform, because they realized what an important service and what great judgment you had in putting the right players with the right singers. Because something that worked maybe for, Aretha Franklin might not be something that would work with Barry White. And you could, I guess, right size the band to go with the different acts. And very few people had that judgment and skill and the resources that you had to be able to put all that together.
That's very true. And I think, and let me go back to the Howard Theater, because that sort of was germane in terms of how I was able to do this. When I was at the Howard Theater, I met Quincy Jones. He was traveling in a band at that time playing trumpet. And the reason I bring his name up is because Quincy was sort of an idol of mine. And he did things, for an example, that I sort of copied, if I may use that term, because I watched how he maneuvered his business as he grew into it. And I think a lot of the things that I was in the back of my mind said to me was, okay, Quincy put this structure together in order to do this particular job. And I said, let me kind of study that for a while. And so I sort of copied, if I may say that, some of his style in terms of the way he did business. So I was very impressed with the Quincy Jones style. And a lot of the things that I'm talking about, I think really came from observing him, and also the gentleman that I worked for at the Howard Theater, his name was Rick Henderson. I liked the way, his manner that he did things too. Because those of us who worked under him at the Howard, we were all very close. We were like a big family, even though we were all professional musicians. So those things were important to me. We're not just getting the musicians, but also getting the right people with the right frame of mind to interact with each other. Because what happens, when you're in music, every musician doesn't really play the music the same way. So you have to be conscious of that when you want somebody to play, say, behind Jackie Wilson, there's a different style or different type of musician with a different mindset that has to play behind Jackie Wilson that may not play behind Barry White. So that kind of thing, it takes a lot of, and I don't want to use the word training, a lot of insight, I guess is the best word, for you to be able to develop that type of skill set in order to make sure you hire the right people.
And the musicians you were working for, and I'm going to use some terminology that Quincy Jones uses. He calls the Howard Theater the crown jewel of black theaters. Mm-hmm. He really appreciated what happened there. And he called the people that performed there, he says, when they look back in history, they will call these groups out of the 50s, 60s, and 70s that performed there, the Mozarts, the Bachs, the Chopins of their time, Duke Ellington, Miles Davis, Ella Fitzgerald, Bird. It was spectacular sets of performances by the creme de la creme of African American performers. And you were an integral part of that in providing and knowing the right musicians to back up those different styles. And that took a lot of know-how.
Yeah, it's a challenge. It was a challenge, it really was.
And in your spare time, you taught college and helped Bowie State University. I don't know how you managed all those things.
I don't either. As I told you a little bit earlier, I don't know how I managed all those things, but it happened.
You're still very active in mentoring students. Tell us about your current projects. What are you doing to stay active in music?
Right now, I'm working with an organization called FAME, F-A-M-E. It stands for Foundation for the Advancement of Music and Education. It's a 501(c) organization. I'm the artistic director for that organization. And we work with young people who are interested in music. We also do mentorship. We do academic training for these young people. And I'm very proud to say that our graduates have gone on to some really outstanding schools. We got kids that have gone to Berkeley. We got one that is off in Juilliard this year. We've got young people who have graduated from the University of Maryland. And all these kids have done this in the arts. One of the things about the academic mentorship that I'm very proud of is the increase in their scores on their SATs. I mean, we've taken these young people, some of them who were doing like 800 on their SATs up to around 1,300. So it's a very, very, very dynamic program, and I'm so proud to be a part of it as an artistic director. So I sort of pick the music that we're going to use. I help to hire the instructors that we have. I'm also the director of our jazz band, which is our premier organization that we have in that group. And then we have what we call a MIT program, which is musicians in training, that those are our little young people who come into it, who may be in the 6th, 7th, and 8th grades. And we call that MIT, which is musicians in training. So it's a very dynamic program. Like I said, it's a 501(c), and it's called FAME. And if anybody's watching this show, it's famemusic.org, and we do take donations.
Well, I'm glad you told us that. And I like the fact that you are remaining active and doing things. I think that people that have your skills and experience and capability to continue to share that with others is perhaps the greatest compliment to you.
Thank you.
What new project are you working on? Not that you don't have enough going on already. Do you have something new on the horizon that you're um,
Aside from involved in writing my book. Oh yeah. I'm sorry. I'm also in the studio now recording my first. This has been my first individual project that I've ever done.
solo?
Solo album.
Okay, tell us
And
about
it's a
that.
religious one. I'm
Okay.
doing all religious songs.
Mm-hmm.
My background in Farmville, for example, is a Baptist church. And so I like religious music. I really do. In fact, all this other music I play, my background is still the church. And so I'm on doing this project, and I've almost completed it. Right now we're in the process of doing the editing and all that kind of stuff. But I don't think I'm gonna do CDs because CDs are not the thing people are doing anymore. It appears to me that I'll have to do the podcast thing or whatever the social media stuff is. I'm not really that techie, but the people who are working in the studio are telling me, sort of guiding me in terms of how I produce this. But I'm doing songs like Precious Lord, Amazing Grace, just a lot of those songs that I grew up with, that I love. And so I'm doing that on alto and soprano. One of the songs that may not be considered religious, but it's a song that I love, that I played as a kid, is Ave Maria. I'm putting that on that album too. Mainly because I just love that song, Ave Maria.
It's a beautiful song.
It's gorgeous. And so I don't think I consider that religious, but I want to put it on the album because I love it so much.
Who are some of the people that are going to be appearing on the record with you?
I got Carol DeShield is on it.
Pretty good.
Yeah. I have Robert Mousy Thompson, who is the drummer that was with James Brown. He's on the album. I have my guitarist, his name is Ike Daniel, who teaches now at Duke Ellington School of the Arts, in D.C., a tremendous guitar player. And my keyboardist, his name is Bill Ford. He may not be that well known across the country, but Bill is a tremendous keyboardist and arranger. And he's out of the Memphis area, but he lives in D.C. And so he's the one that's doing a lot of the arranging as well as doing the keyboard work.
Well, I hope you do make CDs. I would like to buy one. So.
I may produce a few. And the name of the company that's going to be doing this, all of the finished work, is called CD Baby. But they're sort of telling me that people not even buying CD players anymore, I hear. I mean, I don't know, because I have a CD player. I still have an 8-track player. So, even though they don't make 8 tracks anymore.
There's nothing wrong with that.
When
how long until you're going to finish your project? Is it within a year?
Oh yeah, it should be within the next 2 months.
Okay.
Yeah, we've been working on this project now for pretty close to about 12 months now.
And your book, when do you expect that to be complete?
That's up to my writer. She's a little bit, I won't say she's slow. She's very exacting in terms of what she does. And so she keeps going back and forth with editing and that kind of stuff. So I'm not exactly sure. Hopefully, I would like to get it out by at least December.
So what's a story in your book that people generally don't know that you could share with us today?
Well, I think the main thing that I want to talk about in my book, in fact, what I am talking about, is this whole thing about what we were talking about earlier, about being behind the scenes and the importance, for an example, of the teaching and the way I teach and the emphasis that I place on certain things when I teach. I give you a good example. One of the things that I talk about in my teaching experience has to do with how I get my students to concentrate and do the things that they need to do to make themselves better. I have a little philosophy that I have as a band director. I always tell my band students that this band is only good as its weakest player. Having said that, that sort of transitions throughout my professional career too, because I don't want anybody in a band playing who is not going to bring everything to the table, if you understand what I'm saying. Everybody needs to be their very best in order for all of us to be our best. So this kind of dynamic I'm trying to put into my book also, to share that with other people who may want to utilize some of the techniques that I've used over the years. Because what has happened, I think I mentioned this at some time before, a lot of the people, for an example, who call me to work now, I refer my students to do that work, because I have some excellent students out there who are doing quite well, who become very professional, very good players. And I think that they have done that as a result of my philosophy and the way I teach.
Well, you've been behind the scenes, but I would like to end up by talking about people that have seen you and didn't know they saw you. The Clarence Night Orchestra, the Congressional Black Caucus, Phoenix Awards dinners, over 20 years. You played every year for 20 years.
That's true.
Black Engineer Awards Ceremony, 5 years. Mm-hmm. 5 presidential inaugural balls.
That's true.
Many dances, weddings, social events. Clarence, they've seen you, they've heard you, they just didn't know who you were until now.
That's true. I mean, it's amazing all the things that I've done where they really didn't know. I mean, I have my stands that say my name on it, but that's sort of short-lived when you think about it, because they come to the event, they go away from the event, they may enjoy the music, but it's not really talked about. I mean, we're just there as part of the event. So you're right. I mean, we do a lot of things that we don't really, quote unquote, get credit for, even though people enjoy it and they have a good time. But nobody walks away from it saying, oh, did you see Clarence Night? I mean, no, nobody talks about that.
Well, if you're Dionne Warwick, you would know that.
Oh, yeah.
If you were Patti LaBelle,
yeah,
you would know that. If you were Aretha Franklin, you would know that.
That's true.
If you were Al Green or James Brown or Tina Turner or Barry White or Earth, Wind and Fire, they all know Dr. Clarence Knight.
Yep. That's the under the radar thing.
The man that made it happen. They were as good as they were because of the great musicians you put behind them.
Well, you know, that's something that I've always said too, that these shows would not be what they are if they didn't have good backup musicians. And most of the acts, I mean, I've seen many acts where some of them did not do well because they didn't have good backup musicians. But the musicians who are behind these stars we're talking about have to be on top of their game.
And your philosophy of always surrounding yourself with the best people possible, the best musicians possible, really pays dividends.
Yeah, that's what I've tried to do all my life, is try to put the best out there.
Well, we're looking forward to your recording or CD and your book. And I'm interested to see what you're going to do next. So I think there's a lot still to come for Dr. Clarence Knight, and we appreciate the time that you've spent with us here today.
Thank you. I've enjoyed it.